Hi, I'm the domestic feminist. I'm a working married mother of 3, and I like to talk about the everyday challenges women face in the home front from a feminist perspective. Today I want to talk about testimonial and epistemological injustice and how it can be a factor at home. Ever notice how sometimes when you speak about something you know quite a lot about, but people do not necessarily believe you or take you seriously? Maybe there's a coworker or a boss, but sometimes there's even your romantic partner. What is going on there? They should know better. They should understand that what you speak about you have particular insight, knowledge, or lived experience, and yet they speak as if none of that matters. What is driving that? And what about nagging? Why is it that when we talk to our male partners about something that is important to us, but that they dismiss or forget about, we are called nags for repeating the request? Epistemological injustice is what happens when members of a marginalized group of people are not seen as people who know things. Testimonial injustice is when people of that group speak about something they know quite a bit about, but because there is a prejudice against their credibility, they are not believed. The way society is built and run constantly reinforces the bias in favor of male voices, in particular white, cisgender, heterosexual men, and dismissive of other voices. Today I'm going to focus on testimonial and epistemological injustice toward women, but with an understanding that gender intersects with other identities and amplifying the oppression. Take philosophy professor Patricia Williams' experience of going to a store to buy something in Soho, but found the door locked despite the posted hours stating it was open. There were customers inside shopping, so she knocked on the door to be let in, and a salesperson looked her up and down, no doubt noting that she was a black woman, and then said, "We're closed." Williams later shares the story with her college students as an example of everyday racism, only for her students to dismiss it as only her imagination. So now, on top of her experience of everyday racism, she is faced with her credibility being openly questioned by the very students she's entrusted to impart knowledge. She's a college professor, at Northeastern no less. She is a black woman, facts that should make her testimony about her experience believable. I mean, she should know she is black, so her lived experience as a black woman should be enough for her story to be believed about everyday racism. But because she is both a woman and black, she is disbelieved. This is something that can create what philosopher Marylin Frye calls a double bind. A double bind is a situation where a person is faced with 2 or more choices, none of them without some form of consequences. In the professor's situation, having experienced everyday racism, she is of course going to want to do something like tell people who need to learn about this as an important issue. But experience tells her if she does, she likely will not be believed, which then erodes the little credibility black women have in the eyes of society. If she chooses not to speak about it, then the problem continues unchallenged, and people who need to learn about this issue go on believing everything is copacetic. The double bind is that neither outcome is good. Frye explains that if you experience this sort of thing repeatedly, then you're experiencing oppression. This is a common experience for women, wanting to speak about something that is unfair or unjust, and this being met with a lack of concern or even curiosity. And like this professor, we are met with that double bind where if we speak up, we risk being derisively branded as that woman and not being heard at all. So often we stay quiet. Philosopher Kate Mann describes the world that creates this kind of feeling in us as being like the shock collar fence system that is popular with dog owners in suburbia. A system where you can't see the line you shouldn't cross, but you sense it and you keep in your area to avoid the punishing zap reminding you are out of bounds. But even when you're not speaking about the unfairness or injustice you face, you are still not safe from the shocks that keep you in your place. Rebecca Solnit writes about an experience at a party where a pompous host is so condescending, so sure he knows more about something than she, despite the fact that she has written a book about it. Her critically acclaimed book is called River Shadows, Edward Muybridge and the Technological Wild West. And once the host hears Muybridge, he smugly interrupts her to tell her about the very important book on which this subject came out earlier this year. It turns out the very important book that he is referring to is the book she wrote. But he is so high in his own authority that it takes her friend 3 or 4 times telling him that Solna is the author before it sinks in. When it finally does, he goes ashen. That I was indeed the author of the very important book it turned out he hadn't read, just read about in the New York Times book review a few months earlier, so confused the neat categories into which his world was sorted that he was stunned speechless for a moment before holding forth again. That man interrupting her was a shock collar reminder that of course his speech on the subject had more merit than her own. Why? Because of the neat categories the world is sorted in. Testimonial injustice can even be a subtle factor in relationships at home. For years, I tried to convince my husband to do any number of household changes and would come up against skepticism and overall resistance. It'd be so frustrating because I was coming to him wanting for us to make decisions together in the spirit of collaboration, but it ended up being my presenting ideas for him to either agree to or turn down. Then I saw Soraya Chemaly's TEDx talk on the credibility gap, and among many insightful points she made, she closed by giving these 3 phrases to say to make speech more fair. Don't interrupt me. I just said that. No explanation needed. This advice really floored me. The last point was most difficult for me because explaining was the approach I used the most. Around the same time I saw Chemaly's talk, a successful businessman shared his advice with me. The more you explain, the more you lose. And it makes so much sense. When you explain, when you argue, you're trying to convince someone, and it often puts them in a position of assessment, of judgment, not necessarily in a place of intrigue, curiosity, or acceptance. What gets complicated, though, is that women are put in the position to explain or justify themselves quite a bit, hence Chemaly's advice. And men, who speak 75% more than women in mixed settings, don't seem to suffer as much for this. So what can we do? First, I would take Chemaly's 3 phrases and work them into your interactions. It takes time, but don't give up. The fact that it takes a while is part of the process that helps you to be more assertive in conversation in ways that feel comfortable to you, while also helping acclimate those closest to you to your new expectations and your new way of being. Second, explaining is not such a bad thing. Yes, it often works against us, but usually with studies and observations with conclusions such as that women explain too much, the advice that follows is for women to adopt more male-style speech. While that may help in some areas, it can backfire on others. Instead, question why explaining is such a bad thing. After all, when women do this, they give their audience the same courtesy and respect they deserve. They are not simply making a declaration, as a man might, and expecting all to fall in line behind their decree. Instead, women present a solid case and expect some discussion and negotiation. In other words, women tend to enter into a conversation about something they want to change with an understanding that there is a give and take. So if you're about to talk to your partner about something, instead of attempting to mirror likely his own declarative and perhaps unyielding speaking style, see if there's some tweaks you can make to how you explain. So recently, to prepare for making these videos, I started writing up what I wanted to say, and early on I read a couple of scripts to my husband so the 2 of us could discuss how best to create the videos. It was funny because while I was reading to him, I was hearing murmurs of agreement and little huhs of realization, but much of what I was reading to him were ideas I've pitched to him before of things we could do differently in our home. In the past, however, my ideas were met with a lack of motivation and urgency to make these changes. But as he was listening to me read my scripts, I heard him murmuring his agreement, and he stopped me a few times to discuss it. What was going on? I had been trying to talk to him about some of these things many times before, and the conversation would go this way and that, but rarely did he really take my words in and seriously consider them. I don't want to make him sound insensitive and uninterested in my ideas, because he is not. But the listening I was experiencing from him this time was totally different. What was happening? It wasn't that I handed over something I had written for him to read. If I had done that, we might surmise that his reading what I had to say, disconnected from me in feminine-coded speech, might sound more credible to him. But it was not that. He was hearing me read it to him. And furthermore, he was hearing me talk about us, our challenges in running our household. There was no way for him to forget on some level that I was saying the things he was hearing. So what was different? Whenever one writes about something, it becomes clearer, sharper, more articulate, and the fact that a written piece exists in its entirety, even when its reading is interrupted, keeps its message intact, the writer unperturbed. Compare that to the uneven terrain of speech between women and men, where women are constantly interrupted, their ideas taken, they're being required to explain themselves. Writing about something is holding space for your thoughts, your ideas, your feelings, without being challenged before you finish. Writing my ideas down in essentially essay form, formalized them to my husband. And when he would stop me to discuss a specific point, it was not the interruption that normally happens to women when our speech is intruded upon and demands made of us before we had a chance to truly speak. Instead, his asking me to pause to discuss a point was the way conversation around women's ideas should go. And when the brief clarifying discussion of a point was over, I resumed reading my script and he continued to listen. The written word preserved my speech, even with interruptions. And what about testimonial injustice in kids? The cycle of mostly mom telling her kids to do something 1,000 times before it's eventually done erodes our authority at home and for women in the greater world. How do we stop ourselves from inadvertently teaching our kids that our voices are ones to be ignored? I'm trying out a new thing where I introduce a maxim to my family, post it on my fridge, and then refer to it whenever I see something amiss that I want a quick resolution to. The key is to discuss it as a family so that everyone understands the significance of the maxim, and then post it so that the written word of it carries the weight going forward. The maxim acts as a kind of family core value that you all rally around. The posted sign of the maxim speaks throughout the days, and then it only requires a light touch to enforce it. And that is what we need. We need a strategy where our spoken word is preserved for it to be effective. That is my biggest takeaway from this, that we need to be strategic with our words, starting with Chemaly's 3 phases: don't interrupt me, I just said that, and no explanation needed, are phrases that act as stewards of our speech, to not let it get stepped on or ignored. And then in our homes, take that stewardship further by pairing the written word with our spoken words for the highest efficacy. I don't have time to write an essay every time I want to talk about something with my husband, but if I notice I'm repeatedly spinning my wheels with him on an issue, I think I'm going to try writing about it, and when I do, I will write for a broader audience than him. I think that is also key, that when you do write, you need to write to the broader truth. Part of the power of maxims are that there can be truisms that can apply to any household. So when you invoke them, you're invoking a higher way to do things than simply your preferences. And so is the case when you write to an audience broader than your domestic partner. It becomes less a power struggle between the two of you and more of what is right and what works. I hope this is helpful to you. If so, please give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Below in the show notes are resources that may be helpful, including articles and interviews by or about the several philosophers I mentioned, and some of the journalist Soraya Chemaly's work. Have a great day.